South Africa has been in the news for all the wrong reasons lately.
Burial sites, over 1,000 of white farmers, death. They're saying that kill the white farmer and take their land.
The Afrikaner families who sought refuge in America earlier this year have had their claims fast-tracked, whilst other refugees fleeing war have been denied entry.
So we all know by now that President Trump's South African white genocide story was nothing but a farce. Videos were spliced together from different years, even from different countries, just to prove his point, a point that had no truth to begin with. It was all a ploy to give white people from another country some free land. And for me, that rings a bell. South Africa, specifically Cape Town, is one of the best tourist destinations you can go to. It has all the amenities you would expect in a coastal city like Miami or Los Angeles, while being way more affordable for foreign customers. The services here are immaculate. Right next to all this opulence, right next to the fancy cars and hotels, are places that all of the tourists that come to this country would not step 1 foot inside. The shanties. They are as much a part of the South African experience as the richness that surrounds them. And that is why South Africa is the most economically divided country in the world. But how did it get like this? How do we get to the point where a majority black population of 81% only owns 4% of the land in the country? Well, I'm here to tell you. This is a story of greed. This is a story of exploitation. This is hidden history. This is the real South African genocide. The history of South Africa starts off over 350 years ago in the 17th century. At this time, the Dutch Empire was the preeminent power in the world, and the Dutch East India Company, their state-sponsored monopoly, had control of many colonies. One of their traders, a man named Jan van Riebeeck, was sent to southern Africa to scout a potential new colony for the Dutch East India Company. What was interesting about Jan van Riebeeck is that he had been dismissed by the Dutch East India Company before for violating their rules around personal trading. But he was later brought back to lead the expedition to create a colony in southern Africa. Creating a colony for the Dutch Empire in that location had been Van Riebeeck's idea, so perhaps the Dutch East India Company felt obliged to bring him back so that he would be the one to found the colony. Regardless of their reasons, Jan van Riebeeck set sail and arrived on African shores in 1652 and set up the Cape Colony. It was only a small group that arrived in the Cape Colony, about 20 Dutch settlers or so, but as the years passed, that number slowly grew. Jan van Riebeeck was the commissioner of the Cape Colony for years, and by 1658, the population of the Cape Colony had grown to about 200. As the colony grew, Jan van Riebeeck suggested that slaves be brought over to the colony, particularly from Batavia, which is present-day Jakarta, Indonesia. But the majority of their slave force would not come from there. It would come from inside the country itself. Of course, building a colony was not going to be without problems, particularly the problem of the Dutch settlers encroaching on indigenous land. As the Cape Colony continued to grow, they had numerous conflicts with the Khoi, the indigenous peoples of South Africa. The first of the Dutch Khoi Wars broke out in 1659, and the indigenous peoples of South Africa and the Dutch Empire would continue fighting for the rest of the 17th century. The Khoi did show their might, but unfortunately, the gap in technology and weapons between the two powers was simply too great. Over the decades, more and more of the Khoi people were captured and assimilated into Cape Colony society, and they would end up making up the majority of the slaves in the colony. As the opposition decreased, the Cape Colony continued to expand, encroaching on more and more of South Africa's land and displacing thousands of people. And so, slowly but surely, throughout the 18th century, the Dutch Cape Colony expanded, and the Dutch East India Company captured more and more of South Africa's land. But the Dutch Afrikaners would not keep this land forever. The power of their empire was waning, and a new, much more powerful force was coming their way. By the 19th century, the Dutch Empire's influence was fading, and new powers were coming up to take its place. Napoleon Bonaparte, the leader of France at the time, waged war against the nations of Europe to expand France's influence. One of the nations Napoleon was fighting was Great Britain, whose empire had already captured a large portion of the world. Both the French and the British wanted the Cape Colony because it was a strategic location for trade routes. The British captured it first in 1795. After the conflict with Napoleon was over, they returned the Cape Colony to the Dutch, but later reoccupied it for good, and it was at that point the Cape Colony officially came under British rule. And it would stay that way until the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Under British rule, the treatment of the indigenous peoples of South Africa became even more strict. Gold and silver was found farther inland, and so instead of the slave workforce primarily being used for farmland, they were sent into the mines. British officers were carried on the backs of slaves like they were kings, as if they were too mighty to walk on the same ground as the slaves. More and more land was taken away from the indigenous South Africans to make room for the growing population. Even though slavery was abolished in South Africa in 1833, the treatment of blacks in South Africa really didn't change that much. They continued to work for white people up until the 20th century, being their cooks, their servants, the watchers of their children, any and every job that the British colonizers considered unnecessary for them was done by the black people of South Africa. But in the 20th century, the work of one man would take the separation between the two races even further than before. As far as the Western world is concerned, the one thing that South Africa is known for is Nelson Mandela. And the second thing would be the system that he served 27 years in prison for to destroy. That system would be apartheid, the series of laws and regulations that made the lives of blacks in South Africa even harder than they already were. It lasted for 46 years, starting in 1948 and eventually being abolished in 1994. The architect behind the apartheid system was Hendrik French Verwoerd. During Verwoerd's college years in the 1920s, he traveled abroad. One of his travel destinations was the United States. Hendrik was inspired by the separate but equal system that existed in the United States. In the 1940s, while campaigning for this system to be implemented, he would later say that the different races could not grow to their fullest potential if they mixed together. But his true intention was to isolate the races from each other and make sure power continued to stay in the hands of the white population. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act in 1949 did just that, make the union of white people and any other race in marriage illegal. The Group Areas Act of 1950 divided cities into specific areas for the different races. Of course, the whites received the majority of the central developed areas. The Native Building Workers Act allowed for the training of black people in construction, but they could only work in certain areas. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 segregated the education system as well, and the funding for black schools was cut off almost entirely. All of these laws together collectively put the black population of South Africa in a cage from which they could not escape. They could not get the high-paying jobs, they could not get the homes they wanted, they could not get the education they needed, and the amount of land that the entire population collectively was allowed to own was a tiny portion of what their ancestors had once roamed with their herds. It's only just now that the South African government has decided to change that. The so-called white genocide that the president talked about, that is simply the giving back of the land that hundreds of years of pillaging, murder, and exploitation took away from the original population of South Africa. But of course, Donald Trump will never see things that way. So if you think it's harsh that farmers are having their land taken away from them and given back to the black population, just remember the hundreds of years that their ancestors exploited that land, and you tell me if you still feel sympathy. This is not a genocide. This is justice. This has been Hidden History. Like and subscribe. Thank you for watching.